Hello good people and welcome back. Okay, so in the last video we started our talk about futures market and central counterparties, and in this video what we're going to do is just wrap up that discussion. We're going to start however with a little bit of terminology. We're going to talk about open interest here for a second, and what open interest really is the number of outstanding contracts on any futures on any underlying, right? And so you remember that for any long position there is a short position, and so open interest reflects the number of long position or the number of short position, and because a long for every long there is a short, for every contract every contract reflects both a long and a short position. So the open interest is essentially the number of contracts, and every contract has a long and a short. So it's the open interest is only the number of long position or the number of short position on the contract. The settlement price is essentially the closing price. It's just the price just before the final bell on each day. That's the closing price. And the closing price or settlement price is used for the daily settlement process. If you remember the discussion that we had and in our talk about margins, and over here we looked at the settlement price here. These were the prices that we use for the basis of the computation of our margin, what happened to our margin. And so when price change at the end of the day, the daily gains or losses are computed, and then if there is a loss, it is reduced from the margin and to obtain the margin balance. And so that's how it is that those settlement prices are used for margin purpose. Volume of trading is the number of trades in one day. So the volume is going to be different from the open interest, right? And the way we can look at it also is to look at it in the sense that on the one hand a contract might be open and be a new contract which creates an addition to open interest, or a contract might be open to close an existing contract which might make no difference to open interest, or essentially open contract might be created, or two contract to position might be open for the purpose of closing an existing contract which might reduce open interest, and we'll see that again in a little bit. So for now what we want to do is we want to also consider what is an opening price, what is a high and a low, and the price is settled. So the open price is the price at the beginning of the day, the price at which the contract trades at open. The high is the highest price of the day, the lowest price of the day. Prior settlement price is the last day closing price. The last trade is essentially the today's closing price, is today's settlement price. And the volume, of course, as we described earlier, the volume is nothing else but the number of trades in any given day. Now, the delivery on the line is if at all it happens, has to be thought of carefully, and we're going to look at this here in a second. So if a futures contract is not closed, and that's the key word here, if it is not closed before maturity, it is usually settled by delivering the asset underlying the contract. So the contract is open today, and you remember the mechanic that we had, right? And that mechanic said we go through the clearinghouse or the central counterparty. So we open a contract today by taking, say, a long position in the underlying with the central counterparty, and the central counterparty or the exchange clearinghouse is going to open a long position with a third party. That's going to be the short to our long position here. So we open a long position with the CCP, and that position has a maturity of T years or T months. And so if we don't close out the contract before maturity, that's before this date here, the contract has to be set by delivery. And in order to close that position, what we need to do is we need to enter into a short position with the CCP in order to cancel that long position. So as far as the CCP is concerned, that position is closed, no delivery is required. However, if we are not careful to enter into this short position in order to offset the long position that is existing, settlement is usually required. Now, we remember that settlement is initiated by the short party, right? And so if the short party essentially is willing to make delivery of the underlying, the short party has essentially 3 dates that are essential in this process. The first date is going to be the first notice date. That's when the short party declares essentially its intent to deliver. And then you have the last trading day, which is the last date at which the contract can be traded. And you have the last notice date, which is the last date at which the short party can declare its intent to deliver, to make delivery of the underlying. When there are alternatives about what is delivered, where it is delivered, and when it is delivered, the party with the short position makes the choice. And so this is what we referred to earlier. So if at all the contract gives room for the short party to make that decision, to make a choice, all the contract lists options of delivery location, delivery time, and so on and so forth, the choice of the location for where delivery is going to occur belongs to the short party. Now, a few contracts are settled in cash. Those are typically financial contract or financial futures, and the settlement in cash is mostly for those stock indices in euro dollars. When there is a cash settlement contract, when these cash settlement contracts are traded until a predetermined date, and all are then declared to be closed out at that date. And so for financial future contracts, they tend to go all the way until expiration, and the settlement occurs at that point in time when they're considered to have been closed out. And for the futures market, what you have is that mark-to-market allows for those gains and losses to be accumulated over a period of time. So if we go back to our table here, the cumulative gain column here is what we are looking at. So overall, if this contract expires here, overall the short party, which stands to benefit here, is going to make a profit of equal to this cumulative amount of 4,620, whereas the long party is going to make a loss of 4,620. How does the short party make that profit? The short party makes that profit progressively over a period of time. So at the end of the first day, the short party made a profit of 1,800. At the end of the second day, the short party made another profit of 540. At the end of the sixth day, the short party made another profit of 720. At the end of the seventh day, the short party made another profit of 1,260. At the end of the eighth day, the short party made a loss of $180, which means that the long party made a profit of 180, and so on and so forth. So those exchange between margin accounts allows for the profits of the long and short party to be realized over a period of time. So for futures on financial instrument or financial futures, what we have is that the gain and the losses considered to be closed out or settled at expiration of the contract, but that happens over a period of time. For forward contracts, however, because there is no mark to market, that is one exchange occurs at expiration. Now, it used to be that because central counterparties now require collateral, which are cash collateral, and we talked about those collateral early when we essentially looked at the credit support annexes. So a credit support annex defines what the collateral is going to be. Typically, that cash collateral that serves the purpose of a margin for the OTC market where forward contracts are traded. Okay, the futures price patterns are essentially one that we should expect, right? In that, remember the discussion that we had in the last unit that essentially says that the price of the underlying, as the price of the underlying increases or the price of the underlying changes, the futures contract, the futures price also going to change. So that futures price in the previous unit, as we described, was a function of both the price of the underlying, the interest rate, the time to maturity, and so on and so forth, and a variety of other factors. Futures price can be both an increasing function of maturity, which is what is typically the case, and that's why it's referred to as a normal market, or it can be a decreasing function of maturity, which is what we refer to as an inverted market. Now, by this, what do we mean? With all we mean is simply that future price at any point in time t1 should be the future price at time t1 should be less than the future price at time t2 if t1 is less than t2. What does that mean? Well, the future price with a maturity of 6 months will be less than the future price with maturity of 12 months, for example. And that's what we're saying. Futures price is an increasing function of maturity. And we'll talk about that a little later when we talk about valuation. We'll talk about the spread. And so markets are typically partly normal and partly inverted. I'm sorry, you can hear the ambulance passing by there. Yeah. There we go, it's quiet now. We can continue. Now let's answer a couple of questions here. The first question that we're going to answer is, when a new trade is completed, what are the possible effects on open interest? Well, let's look at it in the following ways. If a new trade is completed, the new trade may take a couple of maybe for a couple of purposes. The first one is the new trade might be a whole new contract. Let's say it's a new contract. If it's a new contract and the opposite transaction or the opposite side of that trade is also a new contract, so we say we have one buy, all right, that's our long position. So we're creating a long position, and the opposite to that long position is also a new position that's created. We're gonna have one short position or one sell. So for every buy or for every long, we have one short. That's a sell, right? So for every long we have a sell. That means that there is a whole new contract that is being created because both are new position that I created. The open interest is gonna increase by 1. So we're gonna have open interest is going to be increasing by 1. That is one new contract that encompasses both a new long and a new sell is created. Remember, open interest is the number of contracts that are both long and short position. Now the second scenario is, what if the new position that is open is a long, so that's going to one long. However, the short position that is matched with this long position, right, is not a new one, it's an old position. That is, you're creating a new position to close up, a new long position to close or to offset an original short position that you had. Remember how it works. This is what it works. So we have the CCP, and then we have the trader here. And so the trader initiates a new long position, and that position is matched with another position from a seller. That is the first scenario. Nothing else existed. Now we have a second position that is created in order to offset the initial position. So now I'm creating another short position in order to close up this original position that I had here. And what is going to happen is this position is going to be matched with another trader, for example, and that is going to make no change to open interest because there's still one contract that's outstanding. Although I'm out of here, that contract is still outstanding between these two parties. So this old position is still there, and therefore we're going to have no change in. So it's going to be one sell, and we're going to have no change. Next, where we is look at the third option, where we have a one position that's created to close, right? That's an old position, and another position that is also created to close, so another close position. So if we have two close positions, what does that mean? It means we are essentially destroying a contract. So we can have one long that's created to offset a short that was initially open, so that close up that position, and then we have another short that's created to offset a previously long position that was open, and so this contract is going to be destroyed, and so open interest is going to reduce by 1. So the answer to this question is, when a new trade is completed, the possible effects on open interest depend on the purpose of opening the trade, right? And so when the trade is placed for the purpose of closing an original position, there is no change. When the purpose is created in the other side of the transaction is also a new position, open interest increases. When both sides of the transaction are created to close up originally open position, open interest essentially reduces. Now, can volume of trading in a day be greater than open interest? The answer to that question is yes. Volume can be, because remember that volume is the number of contracts that are traded, and so volume can of course exceed open interest on any specific day. So next we're going to talk about the type of orders that exist out there. Okay, so one we're going to start with is a market order. So market order. And the market order is an order to buy or sell at the best available price out there. So we have no control over the price. We say whatever is the best market price at this point in time, execute the order right away. So essentially this is best price out there. A limit order is a little different from market order because we have full control over price. So we have a specified price. So it's an order to buy or sell here at a specified price or better. A stop loss order is an order to buy or sell when a price reaches a point, a specified point. So our control that we have over the price is essentially one that says that once the stop price is triggered, we don't have any more control. The transaction is executed. So we have a specified price, and that's the extent of our control over price. And beyond that, once the stop price is met or is triggered, there is no more control over the price. So that's the order to buy or sell if a condition is met, the stop price is triggered. That's a stop loss. A stop limit is very similar to it's a combination of a stop loss and a limit order. And so the stop limit is going to be a limit order that is essentially activated at a specified price. Again, here you have a full control over the price. You actually set two prices. You have a limit price and you have a stop price. So once the stop price is triggered, once the stop price is met, the limit price is triggered, and that's how it works. The market if touched order is very similar. The trade is executed for a market if touch at a specified price, right? So it's the immediate execution at a specified price as well. A discretionary order is one that is left up to the discretion of the broker. So you trust your broker, you say, well, I'm willing to sell 100 shares. You have the discretion, the discretion of executing the transaction as you see fit. We just trust the broker to do that on our behalf. The time of the day trade that we have here essentially is an order that is specify the time of the day at which it can be executed, say at midday or at closing or at opening, and so time of the day specify the time at which it can be traded. Each one of these options that we have here are essentially orders that are placed and are cancelled by the end of the day if they are not executed. The time of the day order is one that is meant to be executed at a specific point in time, and so if it's a limit order or a stop loss order that is specific to that point of time, that's how it's going to happen. The open order, in contrast to the other ones, is one that remains open even if it's not filled until the next day, right? So the open order is going to carry over to the following day, whereas the limit, stop loss, stop limit, market if touch orders are all going to be cancelled by the end of the day if they are not executed. The fill or kill order is an order that has to be executed immediately or not, right? So fill it at the best market price or kill it, or fill it at specified price or kill it. And so those are the distinctions that we have there. Now the market for futures and forward contracts has been heavily regulated, and the regulations were designed at this point in order to help protect the public interest. And so regulators have tried, or they're still trying, to prevent questionable trading practices by either individuals on the floor of the exchange or outside groups. And so the goal here is that regulators have understood that having a good view on what the futures and forward contracts, especially in the forward over-the-counter market or the market for forward contracts, having a good view of that market would help prevent systemic risk. And so in the United States, the body that oversees that is the CFTC, and the CFTC is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, that's the CFTC. And the CFTC role is to license the exchanges. The CFTC, if this exchange is created, the CFTC has to license that exchange, for example, approve the contract. So when a new contract on an underlying is created by an exchange, it has to go through the CFTC for vetting. The CFTC also approves broker oversees the activity of broker, and many other activities, right? So the CFTC is that body that oversees the futures forward market, for that matter. Now, another body that does something similar, and that actually over time has taken away a little bit of the weight of this regulatory requirement away from the CFTC, is the NFA. And the NFA is the National Futures Association. And the National Futures Association has over time taken away some of the activities that were some of the regulatory requirements that were the CFTC used to oversee, and the NFA does that. And so in that context, because the NFA is a National Futures Association, the NFA is essentially a self-regulatory body, right? So it is a body made up of futures traders that regulates itself. And the reason they do that is because they have to have a pretty good incentive. They have a good incentive for the good functioning of futures market. The majority of futures traders are hedgers, and they would like for the market to function properly. All right. So next, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the accounting and the tax treatment of futures contracts. So the way you deal with this depends on the purpose of engaging in futures market. So if you're a hedger, for example, it's going to be logical to recognize the hedging profits or losses at the same time as the losses or profit on the item are being hedged. And so the idea here is that if you use an example here, if you, this is let's say June, and you have a contract that expires in March. So in June you enter into a futures contract to hedge a position, say in oil futures, to hedge a position in oil because you need oil sometime in March to fly your plane, or fuel to fly your plane. And at the end of the year, which is December here, you have essentially to recognize gains and losses. The idea here is that the accounting for the gain and losses on the futures and forward on the hedging that you put in place to protect or to lock in the price of oil have to be recognized at this point in time when you actually purchase the oil. So for hedging purpose, those gain and losses ought to be recognized in March. Now, for the speculator, on the other hand, it is simply logical to recognize the profit and losses as they are incurred. So over a period of time, if there are profit and losses that are incurred, they have to be recognized. So by the end, if it's a futures contract, for example, by December 31st, which is the end of the year, the mark-to-market mechanism is going to allow for an accounting of what those gain and losses are paying. And at the end of the day here, at the end of December 31st here, those gain and losses ought to be recognized for a speculator. For a hedger, those gain and losses are not going to be recognized until the end of the life of the contract in March, or until the point at which they close up or they offset the position. The hedger offsets the position. So roughly speaking, essentially, this accounting principle is this is what accounting is, and tax treatment of futures in the United States and many other countries attempt to achieve. They attempt to make sure that hedgers recognize their profits at this point in time, closer to expiration, or when it is that they close up the position, whereas hedgers continuously recognize their position, profit or losses, and that depends on your position. Essentially, are you Are you a speculator or are you a hedger? If you're a speculator, you actually need the underlying, and therefore it is only logical for you to recognize the gain and losses when you acquire the underlying at maturity or expiration of a contract. And if you're a speculator, you don't quite need the underlying, so it's only natural for your gain and losses to be recognized progressively over a period of time. Now, we talked a little bit about forward contract without clearly getting back to what they are and reinforcing that notion. So what we want to do now is briefly touch on an overview again what forward contract is and how it's different from futures contract. Now, you remember that forward contract are traded over the counter on OTC, so they are OTC agreement to buy or sell, just like futures contract, an asset at certain time, at some time in the future, for a certain price. That is a forward price. Now, with forward contract, we also know that there is no daily settlement. All right, in futures contract, there is daily settlement. However, forward contracts now require collateral to be posted with the central counterparty. So although there's no daily settlement by definition, in a practical matter, what we can see is that forward contract, the collateral, the cash collateral that are required by the central counterparty for forward contract or for some forward contract behave in the same manner as margin. At the end of the life of the contract, one party buys the asset for the agreed price from the other party. So forward contracts are generally delivered versus futures contracts that are generally not delivered. So with forward contract, we very often see delivery because they're so customized. They're so much customized that they are not as liquid as futures contract. And so it's not easy, if you will, to close a position in forward contract as it is to close a position in futures contract. The profit and loss graph for futures and forward position are the same. So if you're a long future, or a long forward holder, your profit is going to look something like this, where you will make money if the price of the underlying increases over time, and you will lose money if as the long party, you could lose money depending on whether you're a speculator or you are a hedger or even an arbitrager. Arbitrager looks for risk-free profit, so the arbitrager doesn't stand to lose. But if you're a speculator, that's essentially what you're looking at. You're looking at making money, taking risk, provided that the return on your investment commensurates the risk that you're taking. However, for a hedger, the thought of gaining or losing is not what really is happening. What is happening for a hedger is the thought of minimizing risk. So remember that the hedger looks at minimizing risk, whereas the speculator is willing to take risk provided that the return commensurates the risk that is being taken. And so the long hedger is going to have a profile that looks like that, whereas the short hedger is going to have a profile that essentially look the opposite as that of the long trader. A couple of summary points on forward and differences between forward and futures. Forward contracts are private contracts between two parties. Remember those bilateral agreements, where futures contracts are exchange traded, and they are very, 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 very standardized. So they're contracts that are pre-structured, predefined, and they're identical except for the maturity generally. The forward contract and non-standard contract, whereas future contract is standard. That's the idea of the standardization of futures contract. Forward contract usually one specified delivery date. That is, for forward contract, the delivery occurs at expiration, and that is one time because it's a unique contract, it's a private contract, it's a non-standard contract. However, for futures contract, we have a range of delivery, and the idea here is that we have a contract that expires or matures in, let's say, 1 year, another contract 1 month, another contract that is in 2 months, another one that exchanges in 3 months, and another one that expires in 4 months, and so on and so forth. This different maturity date provides a range of maturity. Although it's the same contract, same standardized contract, they may have different maturities that create a range of maturity dates for futures contract. The standardization of futures contract allows for that. The non-standardization of forward contract does not allow for the creation of identical contracts with different maturities, and therefore the unique contract that we have here would have a unique maturity, and that's why we say that they usually have one specified delivery date. Futures contracts are settled at the end of the contract. That's what we talked about earlier, because they are so customized and so unique. They are not as liquid, so they're typically settled, or deliveries usually occurs for futures contract, whereas for forward contract, whereas for futures contract they are settled daily, and that's with respect to the mark-to-market mechanism, and also the idea that the holder of a futures contract can close up the position before maturity, and that might happen, or that's possible to happen, because of the fact that this transaction occur with the exchange clearinghouse. So the exchange clearinghouse is the other party to all open and closed transactions or positions. Now, delivery or final cash settlement usually occurs for forward contract, whereas it generally occurs prior to maturity for futures contract. So position can be closed before maturity. Typically, we see maturity have arrived before the position can be settled for forward contract. Now, for forward contract, we have some credit risk, whereas for future contract, there is no credit risk. Now, the credit risk here is essentially from the fact that we have no middleman. That is, this is not as accurate anymore. It used to be that there was no middleman, and as we learned earlier, we now have the CCPs, which are the central counterparties, that require cash collateral, and the cash collateral serve as a mechanism to minimize credit risk. So although the credit risk has been minimized, there's still some degree of credit risk because there's no mark-to-market still with the forward contract. With futures contract, however, there is mark-to-market, which means that the positions are essentially settled daily, and that allows for the reduction of that credit risk, and actually the almost elimination of credit risk. So there's still some residue of credit risk for forward contract, whereas there's virtually no credit risk for futures contracts. And finally, we're going to touch on foreign exchange quotes. Essentially what this says is that futures exchange rates are quoted as the number of US dollars per unit of foreign currency, and forward exchange rates are quoted in the same way as the spot rates, essentially. So the distinction between futures exchange rate that are quoted as the number of US dollars, so that's going to be US dollar per one foreign currency, whereas the forward contract that are quoted at the same way as the spot exchange rate. And what that simply means is that the Great Britain pound, the euro, the Australian, and the New Zealand dollars are quoted as US dollars per unit of foreign currency or other currencies. The other currencies, which are the Canadian dollar and the the Japanese yen are quoted as unit of foreign currencies per US dollar. So these initial currencies, Great Britain pound, euro, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollars. So all these currencies are quoted the same as futures, right? A number of US dollar per unit of foreign currency. However, the other exchanges are quoted as units of foreign currencies per dollar, and that's just the opposite, the direct versus indirect quotation there. All right, so this wraps up our discussion of futures market and central counterparties. A brief summary of all that we've talked about essentially is we've talked about the mechanic of the futures market, which is a lot more involved than that of the forward market, because futures market have had to deal with exchange clearing houses for a long time. And so the exchange clearinghouse allow for the minimization of credit risk by managing the margin accounts. And so exchanges are going to require initial margin, and the initial margin are going to be posted with the exchange by the exchange members, and the exchange members are going to maintain variation margin on the daily basis. However, the brokers that have their account with the member of the clearing house will have a margin account with the member that would require an initial margin, a maintenance margin, as well as a variation margin. The variation margin would only be posted after a margin call. Now, the futures and forward contracts are used to be very different. Now the lines are very blurred getting blurred between the two, in the sense that the forward contract did not use central counterparties before. Central counterparties are now required for standard forward contracts because of the financial crisis that we observed in 2008 and because of fear of systemic risk. And so the differences between futures and forward contracts over time have narrowed essentially, and that's what we are learning here. In the next unit, what we're going to do in the next unit is essentially talk about the various hedging strategies that can be engaged in using futures contract. Now, you remember our discussion early on that there are a couple of uses of derivative instrument. We can use derivative instrument for hedging purpose. We can use derivative instrument for speculation. We can use derivative instrument for arbitrage. And so if we're using derivative instrument for hedging, the approach to trading or the strategies that are involved are unique and very different, and they are a function of what we plan on doing in the physical market itself. And that's going to be the object of our next discussion. What are the hedging strategies that can be used that can be implemented using futures contract? Okay, so this wraps it up. I will see you in the next video.